Welcome to Descendants of the Imagination. My name is Dennis Morton, and with me this evening are Stephen Kessler and Doren Robbins. Well, we've had conversations on the poetry show before. I think this is the first time we've ever had a camera on us while we're talking. I'd like to ask each of you how you came to writing in general.
It's more of a mystery to me than anything. I would say I had tendencies towards solitude. It can come in a period of crisis, which is when I first started writing, like in my teenage years. And I was lucky enough to have an older brother who was an artist, who started to put books my way that were very instrumental in developing a kind of a knowledge that I could refer to that made sense to me about the world. And, he was a painter, and I saw his works all around me. And I saw that there was indeed a way of expressing oneself and contacting one's imagination, and that it was very attractive to me to be that type of a person.
You talk about crisis. I've been working with incarcerated children, and writing often seems to be a way to deal with the crisis that they're going through, and it's amazing what some of them produce.
Yeah, along that line, I would say, even though there's a lot of arguments in terms of creative writing workshops and teaching creative writing, etc., that writing is a form of therapy, and I don't want to reduce it to that, but I think that there are a lot of people that are not going to become artists, and that it's just fine for them to take creative writing and find a way to be intimate with themselves through that process, like you're saying, so that they do have some recourse other than drugs or alcohol or whatever the other things are that people, deal with their problems with. So that although I'm a very pure artist in terms of being critical of teaching creative writing, on the other hand, I'm the exact opposite, and I know that I'm giving people certain kinds of tools that whether they develop themselves into a craftsperson with those tools or not is not for me to decide or figure out. But they will always have that, whether it's writing in a diary, a journal, or in fact writing poems or songs.
It really doesn't matter what room I've ever been in as a poet. I always bring with me my desire to write and to want to contact whatever it is that's in the content of what I'm carrying around. This space for me has been a remarkable space. I've been able to work on my visual art here as well as my writing. And I designed it so there's a quality not just of inhabiting the space, but of having designed and created the space. Juxtaposing my beginnings as a poet with where I'm at now is a difficult question to answer. I think that we tend to want to think chronologically about everything, because we simplify everything. But okay, in my early years, the first big thing for me was to get over trying to write like Dylan Thomas and to write like an American. This is a big thing for me. I'd listen to Dylan Thomas's recording. I'd walk around, like Doren Robbins is walking on the street. This booming voice in my head of Dylan Thomas. I remember being 21 years old, experiencing for the first time duende, a force that completely denuded me in terms of rational consciousness. And I was in a state of in which I was, how would I express? I was utterly porous. I was utterly open, with no defenses, with no rational mind. And I was writing what was essentially in the context of a love poem, but it was really an ode to life. And I was trembling. I was literally trembling and shaking while I wrote, feeling a kind of an ecstasy. Lorca describes it in flamenco terms, in terms of the presence of death, which elicits or opens up a certain corridor of consciousness. But what is it? People say it's a Dionysian experience or vitality of energy. And I've written, in that state, several times, many times, a lot of times. It's definitely a passionate experience. And it is this kind of a connection with, I believe, what they refer to in the East as the subtle body, where certain things are opening up inside of you that always lie dormant unless you initiate yourself into certain practices which stimulate these parts of this very subtle inner life that we have. And that somehow was something that made me feel that I was a real fabricator. And I don't mean fabricator in a negative sense. I mean it in a craft-like sense. That you can't fabricate things into art unless you have that experience. And it does go back to that very common Whitman phrase, if I was the man I suffered, I was there. Well, I was the man, I was experiencing ecstasy, I was there. I know what this feeling is about. What I'm getting at here in terms of the juxtaposition is that person is still me. It's not like that person has evolved to something else or chronologically has just gone now to the next step of that. And then no, that person is still there.
I'm going to begin this reading with a poem I wrote years ago about a journey I took alone in the Mediterranean. And I spent most of my time on the island of Crete. And I think one of the things I was trying to capture in the poem was a kind of a recollection of being lost. But that kind of lostness that is in the process of discovering yourself in some way, moving on to the next part of your life, so to speak. I was always into Buddhist philosophy, but I realized I was not a Buddhist, in all honesty. So that's where the title of this poem comes from, Not a Zen Man. Roamed around drunken on Crete, maybe too long. In my chaos, I met an obsessed man from Belgium who studied Zen. A man about 50 roaming around after a little stone of cancer swallowed his wife. Drinking wine from a bottle outside his tent, we talked about books until I mentioned Thomas Morton. Then he leapt up, spilling cigarette ashes into our wine and all over my black sleeve. He started going on about Thomas Merton's book, Zen and the Birds of Appetite, addressing me abstractly, saying there is nowhere to go, that we aren't here, that nothing's here. He was raving about a mountain and about a woman. And when you are nowhere, she comes to you because there is nothing there, and she will climb the mountain because nothing is there. You aren't there, only a mountain. And his eyes were wildly alert with something he had taken from that monk, Thomas Morton. Not from the other books we talked of, not from Homer or Dostoevsky or Lawrence Durrell. His Savior, he said, the one who led him to the Greek islands in the first place. I didn't know about saviors. If I had a savior, it was Dostoevsky, because I always mistook passion and exaggeration for character. I was a chaotic man, not a Zen man. I was a man of bitter seeds, not a Zen man. When the cart stopped, I was the one who whipped the cart, not the ox. Later, roamed drunk back through bamboo to the room of a chaotic man, with my floorboards and the handrail uneven, the stairway gouged, holes throughout the moldings. I thought, never mind, this is my stitched thing. This is my pocked thing. If only I could sit on that ledge farther down within it, I thought. If only I could hold that clove of water there.
The thing that I find when I write now is I've never been so aware of what the truth is of my experience and my perceptions and my memories. My feelings. There's absolutely no way to deny who and what you are and have become. That's a gift.
During the Occupy period, but it's been ongoing to me, it's just that Occupy happened finally. But I wrote a poem called Neighborhood Under the Wire. The guy was right who said I was lucky to get in just under the wire. But hasn't it always been just under the wire or else the whole screwed up time, whatever the options? How can anyone born without automatic privilege not see it? Maybe they don't know how to see it, unless they're forcibly not supposed to see it, unless they just keep their mouths shut about not seeing what they see, whatever they think or can't think, or don't know how to think about seeing it. And nobody calls on the phone and says, hey, you better warm up your 4 cylinders in 9 minutes and get under the goddamn wire. Are there really people that believe someone saying is going to call and let it ring 2.5 times as a signal for when you should get your ass in gear to make it under the wire? It's the thrust of self-pity I'm talking about. Some people know they're born to brutes and power, and conditions aren't that stable under the wire. There's not much left to divide up, and when it finally happens here, the armed robots of whoever rules in the name of whichever ocracy or ism will let you know who gets what. As for me, I have one earplug their current police birds didn't manage to peck out of my head, and I will fight for it.
Wow. So we've heard some pretty scary stories about Big Brother and the computer. It's almost as if you're working on your computer and just doing a rough draft, that even that could fall into the minions of Big Brother. And what are your thoughts about technology and computers and writing?
I would say that we basically live in a world, a totalitarian world, and there's no escaping it. I mean, as they say, you should be ashamed if you're not on an FBI list. But be that as it may, I don't really worry about it because I don't have the type of prestige that would put me in the context of someone who's charismatic.
I just don't feel that poetry in this country has the kind of prestige or public significance that anybody cares what we're writing, and it gives me a sense of great freedom.
Stephen, how did you come to writing?
Well, for me, it wasn't a matter of crisis, because I was like 7 or 8 years old when I got into this seriously. In terms of learning the formal enchantment of the technical aspects of poetry, so things like rhyme and meter and surprising one's imagination with images that you didn't anticipate, or with jokes, as in the case of what I was doing a lot of. So for me, it was really more playing around with the forms. Speaking of older brothers, my older brother Rick, who is 8 years older than I am, used to write very funny parodies of famous English poems. So that the imitation of him in doing that led me to start reading famous English poems and writing parodies of famous English poems.
Were his musings well received by his peers?
Oh yeah, his friends thought his poems and his parodies and his poems about their social life were very, very amusing.
Well, that's what I was getting at, the idea that, my brother does this and people laugh, and that's a way to... so it's kind of a backward way into experimenting with language.
I thought I was doing something, and it was doing something to me. I mean, that's really the way it turned out.
Yeah. I was told yesterday by a kid that you can, with the computer, you can now get just the beat itself. And these kids want me to bring them some beats that they can write to. It's amazing.
Have them write homophonic exercises where you take the original poem and you write something that sounds like it, but bring it up to date. This is exactly the way I learned to write.
I think that you are one of the best essayists I have ever read. When you were publishing The Sun,
I was the editor and publisher.
And The Sun was a weekly newspaper here in Santa Cruz.
One of the predecessors, actually the most immediate predecessor of the Santa Cruz Weekly. And then I started writing book reviews for I think it was the Santa Cruz Independent, which was one of the, several newspapers back. And then the editor of The Independent, Buzz Bazor, invited me to write an op-ed column about anything rather than... I had the literary beat for a while because that was all I felt qualified to write about. But Buzz, I guess, recognized that I could write with some style on, and just invited me to write about whatever I wanted to. And so that's how I got started writing essays and journalism. So, I mean, part of my essays are journalistic and some of them are more literary, but they all, even when I was writing a political column, it was frequently from sort of a cultural point of view, because I don't feel like I have that much new to add to the political conversation, except that I come at these questions from a poet's sensibility.
I'm thirsty for more of them. I haven't seen any.
Well, you know,
recently.
I've been writing for the Sentinel quite regularly. I mean, about, I don't know, they published about 6 of my op-ed pieces as we speak. You know, it's another dimension to writing. It's another form. And just to boil it down to the most simplest fundamentals, that I feel that when I'm writing an essay, my primary obligation is to the reader. Whereas I feel when I'm working on a poem, my primary obligation is to the poem. You know, to bring the poem to its fullest realization. Like writing these 550-word op-ed pieces for the Sentinel has been really interesting, because I never wrote an essay that was 550 words before. You know, it's really short. And that's where my training as a poet comes in, because, you know, poetry is generally often a condensation of thematic material into a very small amount of space, at least lyrical poems. So, you know, essays are another, I don't know, I switch channels.
Time I'd like to ask you a little bit about your life as a translator.
I am a creature of habit when it comes to writing. Writing is as far as I'm concerned, it's a bad habit. But I'm stuck with it because I've been doing it all my life, and I find that I do it in lots of different settings. I don't have like one, you know, fixed routine. But I often start things sitting in this chair, and when I have a draft, sometimes I move over to my desk, pull the cover off my 74 Adler manual portable, which has been serving me faithfully for 40 years. The first draft is, I try to make it really spontaneous. There are a lot of, you know, writers have different habits, and my first instinct, whether I'm writing an original poem or an essay or doing a translation, is to be as spontaneous as possible with my sort of intuition guiding me. I don't always believe that the first thought is the best thought, like Allen Ginsberg famously said, but I do, I kind of trust the unconscious in a way, probably having to do with my early immersion in surrealism and the surrealists' faith in the unconscious as a source of the true, you know, creative impulse. But then, you know, if I'm doing a translation, I always have to go back and see that I haven't gone too far from the original, because you have a dual obligation. At least 2 things you got to keep in mind. One is that you have an ethical responsibility to the original poet and to the poem to give a reliable representation of what they did, what they wrote. But at the same time, you have a creative obligation to make it come alive as a poem in English. So this is a very interesting tension that's created, and to me, it's a great creative challenge. I mean, easily as hard as finding the right word for an original poem, or, you know, the right phrase or the right image. You're doing exactly the same thing. You're trying to find equivalents to the experience that's being described, and you just have to go on your nerve. This is a poem by Vicente Aleixandre, who's a Spanish poet of the 20th century, 1898 to 1986. He won the Nobel Prize in 1977, and this is from a book called Poems of Consummation, which I recently published a translation of. This is a poem called Song of the Night Day. My youth was queen, for a day anyway. It fell in love with the North Star, a rose's compass, with the winds shifting, turning. It fell in love with the day. There it went, ruler of waters, hawk of the air, feather. It fell in love with night. Under the sea, lights. All the deep lights of the deepest stars. Stars in the depths, like fish on high. It fell in love with the sky, where it walked on lights, and rested in winds while it slept in waves, while it fell in the waterfall, and smiled in creamy foam. It fell in love with an order, and undermined it, and when it climbed the abyss, it threw down the skies. O oneness of the day, when in love it was night. Poemas de la Consumación by Vicente Aleixandre. And, you know, I have the book open on the table. I have a couple of dictionaries open on the table. As far as I'm concerned, I am impersonating the original poet. You know, I mean, ideally, it's a kind of forgery. You know, you are tricking the reader into thinking that this was written originally in English, and the way you do that is by making it such a good poem in English that the reader forgets that it's a translation.
What's your guess as to when poetry actually originated?
Yeah, that's a good one.
I heard W.S. Merwin answer this question in an interview one time, and he said he thought that it came from the invention of consonants. that people, you know, sort of pre-articulate people would, you know, sort of send up these moans and these vague kind of laments that were all vowels. But when people realized that their mouths could make sounds, hard sounds, that was the beginning of poetry. That's what Merwin said. Historically, you know, I mean, some people say poetry started with cave drawing and painting and, you know, pre-verbal or pre-musical forms, and other people say, well, poetry is an oral art that started with song.
It's something that has definitely been understood, I think, internationally and for all of time as a practice that we need, that is not just healing, but just something that is fertilizing to be a human being, to either be able to make these songs, write these poems, or in fact memorize them if you're a part of a group and recite them yourself.
In terms of reciting poetry, could we get a short poem from each of you?
Okay. Well, speaking of, you know, ancient artistic practices, this poem was written at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York.
At the museum?
At the museum. I frequently write on location. I mean, I really, you know, I always carry a notebook, and a lot of poems start when they're, you know, I'm in a public place. But I was looking at this exhibit of Chinese, ancient Chinese scroll landscape paintings.
Some dynasty.
It could have been. I don't remember the dynasty, but they were old. This is called Journey in a Brushstroke. He couldn't work because the ink was frozen, so he had to wait for spring to release the river on which he would launch his fragile, imagined boat. The long interlude is syncopated by the sound of an elevator moving slowly between museum floors, where galleries open into ancient landscapes and cultures so remote you can smell their silences reach up through layers of lost ages, asking to be remembered by anyone, however distracted by their own fading civilizations, professional problems, familial obligations. So distant from these whispering scrolls, mountains and streams to which the old recluses fled from the corruptions of their governments.
I've been saying for a long time that we're not lacking for wonderful poets in this country, but what we're lacking is an audience. Why do you think it is?
I think it goes to the pragmatism of American culture. That poetry is useless. You know, as Auden said in his elegy for Yeats, poetry makes nothing happen. And that's part of its value. It's kind of gratuitous. It has no practical application. Except that now that humanities are becoming increasingly marginal in our sort of economically driven model of education, where everybody has to have a technical education in order to get a decent job when they get out of college. That too is like a manifestation of sort of a pathological pragmatism in American culture.
I think that Stephen's point is well taken in terms of the Protestant work ethic in this country. That it just doesn't make sense for you to, be someone who's going to be, in that context, a dreamer. There's never any thought of what you would do with your leisure time in this type of an economic system, because they don't really want you to have leisure time. They'd rather have you just work all the time.
Would you read the Latina poem?
Then I noticed, through a triple Americano awakening moment, in the mall food court, a young Latina cleaning around by the chrome rail at Saboro Pizza, maybe Guatemalan, possibly Salvadoran or Honduran, could have been Argentinian or Colombian, Chilean, Bolivian, Panamanian. Good chance of Peruvian, Venezuelan, Nicaraguan, Mayan, Toltec, Sephardic, Huichol coffee plantation, or U.S. fruit company or tobacco company, or auto industry slave labor robot, or CIA-trained death squad, Guardia Nacional, butchery massacre survivor. Several tables down from mine, roughly stacking chairs on tops of tables, cussing in Spanish. In the mall food court, she hates her job. I hate her job.
Here we are, apparently the richest country in the history of humankind.
And we allow rich people.
We allow abject poverty, though, to exist. 45, 46 million Americans are living in poverty, and 25 million of them are children. And you write about this. This is, I'm sorry I'm blabbing, but you write about these issues, and I think I admire it very much. I'm glad that you do. Thank you both, Doren Robbins and Stephen Kessler, for being my guest here on A Conversation with Literary Artists. And there will be more segments of this program, I believe.